Hi, this is James Paterson, and I'm here with Jaap van Oerle. Hi, Jaap.
Hi, James.
So we're going to continue our discussion series on auditing in biopharma, but we're into some discussions that are more general now. And there's been an underlying theme in what we've been talking about, which is this overall journey from old-fashioned internal auditing to more modern internal auditing. And Jaap's going to talk us through some thoughts and perspectives on how to see that journey. In a subsequent video, we're also going to talk about how the career journey works in internal auditing in biopharma. Jaap, over to you now to talk about the journey of an internal auditor.
Thank you, James. So welcome, everyone. So what you see here is a little storyline about how I have experienced in my own career when I started what we today call a traditional auditor. And in essence, when you start with the objectives and the scope of the audit, the approach and the expected outcomes of the audit, and then impact and value of the audit assignment, and finally the perception of how recipients of audits perceive internal audit. With hindsight, I look at this traditional auditor as a function that looks at how things are versus how it's supposed to be. In German, they call this the Soll and the Ist. And sorry, the traditional auditor measures the gaps and recommends improvements to close those gaps. Usually this happens in an area where the auditor is very, very experienced, in the middle of his comfort zone, and typically audits the same thing over and over again, and the incremental value is relatively limited after a while. And so for me, the traditional approach for internal audits creates something that I call the illusion of control, and the perceived value by the people that we audit as these guys are going to get me in trouble with my boss. So that's a little bit my hindsight about how, when I started as an auditor, I would look at the traditional auditor today. Do you have anything to add or to comment on that, James?
So I think you're right. I think that if you have an internal audit department that you recognise as being a police function, then you don't really have an internal audit function that fits what's going on in modern audit departments. And the change is coming from new heads of internal audit who are tired of operating in that way, but obviously it's also coming from senior managers and board members who don't want themselves to have purely a police function. So certainly if you are not doing modern auditing, as you're about to explain, you really need to look at this hard, because the appetite for organisations to accept traditional auditing is going to reduce and reduce and reduce over time.
Thanks.
Okay,
Thanks,
yeah.
So a modern way of looking what an auditor is or aspires to be. Some people use the word business partner, others they prefer the word trusted advisor. But in essence, what these people aspire to is to provide assurance on what matters most to the organization. And what matters most is translated in the organization's objectives, in their purpose, and developed further in their strategies to see how they are going to achieve those organizational objectives. Now, this of course takes the auditor well outside of his own comfort zone, because he would typically go into areas that he hasn't or she hasn't audited before. And so rather than placing reliance on some established control frameworks that prescribe how things should be, the internal auditor needs to develop what good looks like himself, and needs to develop a number of hypotheses and assumptions about whether risks are well managed by playing out a number of scenarios that illustrate that if this happens, what could be the measure that manages the impact or limits the damage. And usually this would move towards decision making and the conditions in the decision making processes and the risk awareness that management displayed in their decision making. Now, of course, these are things that are much more vague and intangible to audit. But this is where the internal auditor needs to go. And as he moves into those areas that he doesn't know so well, he needs to bring in people that have actually the understanding of how risks are taken in the environment that the internal audit function is moving into. So if you give I'll give a very simple example here. If in the strategy for the organization, a major product launch is planned and will be critical for the success of the organization, for the share price, for the future of the company, internal audit should have the capabilities of launching an audit on a product launch. And that's very different from auditing against an established control framework. Now, if in the product launch strategy, market access is a critical function that should create the conditions for a successful launch, internal audit will have to look into the market access function and understand what market access does and what good looks like in market access. And to do so, internal audit will have to bring skills into the audit team that actually understand market access. Now, the advantage here for internal auditors is if they go into uncharted territories, things they don't know about, they will be having this ability to give the business that they look at a fresh look. This fresh look from the outside in, challenging some common thinking of management is actually very healthy. And so what for people, in this case, for instance, in market access, seems to be common knowledge or accepted theories, internal audit will challenge those. And that creates not only healthy discussions, very often also surprises. And it's from those surprises and deeper understanding why we do things that internal audit can help shaping the future. It gives a sense of purpose to the organization. And instead of keeping auditees out of trouble with their boss, they can actually help the business staying out of trouble with regulators or their own board. So it's a different way of looking at things and really zoom in on what is it that matters most to the organization's future, not what internal audit thinks is the most important controls. Anything that you want to add, James?
Yeah, I think that what's really important and maybe surprising to people is that internal audit is partly about simply being systematic and rigorous in what it does, double checking certain things, but really being smart in double checking. But your point about the hypothesis is really interesting. In practical terms, that would mean an auditor saying something like, I'm wondering whether you feel that the communication between your department and this other department is as smooth as you would like it to be. I'm wondering whether this could happen. And these are hypotheses, they're guesses, but they're smart guesses. And you'd be surprised when you start having that sort of conversation with a business person. They'll say, actually, yeah, I've been trying to work with this other department, but actually they seem to have difficulty understanding what I'm saying. And you end up with internal audit being able to join up different parts of the organization. Yes. So I think that would just give people a practical example of what this hypothesis looks like. And then the other thing that I'd like to say, linking to everything that you've been saying about keeps you out of trouble, and the phrase that we use is gives insight, is, as you said, Jaap, a fresh angle. Now, the obvious fresh angle for an internal auditor is depth. We're going to go deeper and double check certain specific information, data in more detail than you, the business, may have had the chance to. But it's much more than that. It's not just depth. It's about a fresh angle on a problem, or joining things together to see whether they fit as smoothly as you think. So any good internal audit department now, in terms of this business partnering, will be giving you, is just as you said, Jaap, this insight idea, which is, you know, I've been working on this for ages, says the business manager, but I didn't realize that was not working properly. Would that be your experience, Jaap, in terms of building the relationship between internal audit and the business?
Yes, absolutely. What happens very often is when you go into places that you don't really know, but as a team you can look at very hard. But by not having any preconceived ideas, you give everything a challenge. And more often than not, what you see as management's response after often a first denial, of course, they would respond with, we hadn't looked at it that way, and we hadn't thought about that, which is about this risk awareness box in the middle. Because of this fresh look that 3 or 4 outsiders who work jointly together in a very collaborative way with management and have this opportunity to give everything a fresh look, a new perspective, which then results in, we hadn't thought of that. And that's where the power comes from, because that creates then the opportunity to reshape the path you're on and shape your future in a different way. And that's where the opportunity is.
Lovely. Well, I hope we've given people some useful things to think about, and we'll stop there and have another webinar shortly on career progression and what it's like to work in a good internal audit team. Jaap, thanks again for your great inputs.
Thanks, James. Thank you too for your comments.
Okay, lovely. Bye.
Bye.